What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Existential Stoic Podcast, episode 49. Today, we are joined by special guest Greg Sadler, PhD in philosophy from Southern Illinois University, Carbondale, president and founder of Reason.io, editor of Stoicism Today, and popular YouTuber. Welcome, Greg. How you doing?
I'm doing okay. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah,
That's great to have you.
I was very excited because you have a nice long bio, so I feel like an announcer doing this. But
We could just do the bio the whole time. You just read it down, and I'll just give a thumbs up or
just give you your accolades and go away.
That was great. So
make it civil.
So you've got a lot of stuff that you've been doing, a lot of stuff on your resume, and actually now you've kind of brought philosophy and bring it to a practical use sense of it so that everybody can benefit from philosophy. So we're going to talk today kind of about philosophy and practice. So I guess to begin with, can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing now?
Well, it's more or less the same thing I've been doing for about the last 10 years. I was in, like a regular academic set of positions in the first part of my career, although the first teaching gig was in a maximum security prison for 6 years for Ball State. And that was actually quite good. But unfortunately, Indiana, which at one time was the nation's leader in prison education, it was always a hard sell to the citizens, even though its value proposition for it is demonstrated to be incredibly good. And during the economic downturn of the 2007, 2008, they managed to phase it out. So then I was at Fayetteville State University and, doing the typical professor thing, but I was getting more and more into doing philosophy in public ways, and people were tapping me for giving professional consulting and stuff like that. And so then I left that position behind, even though I was up for tenure and promotion, because my, at that time, fiance, now wife, was up in New York, and we were doing the long distance thing, and that really sucked. And so, she wasn't coming down to North Carolina, and fortunately so, because that state just went into a tailspin. So then I moved up to New York, and then I was an adjunct. And then I both had the time to start doing some of the things that I'd wanted to do for a while that I was doing in kind of a informal way, like the philosophical counseling, for example, or the consulting work. But I also got to shoot a lot more video. Marist College, where I was adjuncting, was cool with me bringing in cameras into the classroom, and that's where the YouTube channel really started taking off. And then the YouTube channel drove a lot of business my way. So there's been this back and forth thing where, I create videos, and then people see them, and then they're like, hey, this guy can talk. Let's bring him in to give a talk. And, or, I'd like to work with him. So a lot of what I ended up doing was more or less making stuff up on the fly in terms of structure, not in terms of like the content. I would take philosophy, and as it turns out, the philosophy that I was interested in was very practical if you read it the right way. So not just say Stoicism, but Aristotelianism. If you actually understand Aristotle well, or Descartes, or even Hegel, there's a lot of stuff in there that you can take and make work for people who don't even have to hear that you're working with Aristotle. So like when I go in to talk to businesses and I'm going to tell them about anger management, I don't tell them that this stuff's coming from Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas, whoever, until they actually ask, because it might be a turnoff for them, because they had a crappy intro to philosophy class, and they're like, oh, Aristotle, I don't want that stuff, But the ideas are really great. And so much of what I do is work as a translator, taking the ideas and terminology and whatever else is going on and putting it into examples and an idiom that ordinary people can get. What Alistair McIntyre calls plain persons, meaning people who aren't academics. And it turns out that there's a huge market for it, because there's a vast reservoir of desire out there that you guys are probably tapping into as well, for really substantive engagement with ideas where you're not, like, as we say, dumbing it down or just giving it as bullet points, but you're presenting it in a way that's accessible for people who they're not specialists in an area, right? And they can see how it would be applicable for their life. And that's definitely not being met by traditional academics, with rare exceptions. My friend and colleague Massimo Pigliucci would be a great example of somebody who is doing that sort of stuff, right? Actually, he was just on your show, last guest. But most academics are not interested in doing that, and actually are kind of hostile to the idea. I had a chair in one of the departments around here at a recent conference tell me that what I do isn't philosophy at all, and it was kind of a turf thing, But so that's not being met, and our entertainment industry is definitely not meeting that. Even if it puts out shows like The Good Place, that is watered down philosophy. It's not. It's not the real stuff, And so things like this, like what you're doing or what I do in my work, that allows for that need and that desire, which I think is rooted in human nature, to start to get met. And so it's, I'm terrible at marketing and organization, but my business is actually flourishing, and I have more clients I have more client requests than I can fill, precisely because that need is out there, and it's real. So
it's it's interesting that you said that too. It's like translation too, because I think you find that a lot, where I think like academic philosophy particularly is a very sort of like, it turns people off by just saying the name, right? Because you get this image in your head of like these people like buried in books and speaking in a way that you can't even understand or engage with. And then their audience, it always used to bother me too, or it always still bothers me, is that you're working so hard on this stuff, but your audience is so narrow because you're unwilling to make it, suitable for a broader audience. And so that sort of tension, you end up with, no one really engaging with your work. And it's a shame, because the ideas are there and they're important. And I think, like you said, right, it speaks to a basic human need. I think we all want to understand our world and understand ourselves and know how to act.
I think there are the academics who really do have like their narrow niche, and they would like to just be left alone to work in that one area. And teaching is kind of it's an afterthought for them, because they can't get the students that interested in that one thing that they're interested in. And there are always going to be people like that. And that's not just in academia. You find that in corporate America and in hospitals. There'll be people who are super, super into this diagnostic procedure, but they don't care about anything else, And then I think there's a lot of academics who they're working with an older model that never was going to work out for them, because there are academic stars, right? So I mentioned Alistair McIntyre. McIntyre wrote tons and tons of great academic articles. He also, by the way, did consulting work for like electric companies and things like that. And his books, he actually stayed at Notre Dame for a very long time, and deliberately chose not to teach graduate students, but rather undergrads, even though he was like this huge star, because he thought that was more important. And we could have a whole conversation about that. But McIntyre is a great example of somebody who could make it just in selling copies of After Virtue alone, just the royalties on that. And I think a lot of academics think that they're going to be that person. And so they don't try to reach out to people outside of their field in academia, let alone people, the person on the street or anything like that, through all the things that are available. So like, we're podcasting right now. This is a popular medium. It's smart to go on it, right? You've got blogging, you've got, if you want to put out a book on something and you don't want to jump through all the silly hoops of the academic presses, which are a whole, labyrinth by itself, you can go on Amazon and create a book and shoot it out there. And there isn't that stigma of, it's self-published, it's a vanity project. People are buying that sort of stuff. And so if academics really want to reach a wide audience, they can do it. And then there's people out there who are doing it, it's good to see that there's more and more, especially in the younger generation, who get it. I think they get it in part because the job market is so bad that they realize, they're not going to get the tenure track job.
No, not anymore.
Yeah, it was bad in my time. I'm Generation X, and we had this experience of going out into the job market, applying for positions, and then getting emails back that said, well, sorry, you didn't get it, but there were 300 qualified candidates for this position. And our mentors, who are, mostly boomers and older, that wasn't the case for them at all. It was more the opposite, where somebody would call them up, out of the blue and say, hey, we got a job out here in St. Louis. You think you can move here and take it? So they were used to this gravy train thing. We were used to the first wave of austerity, and they couldn't give us any effective guidance at all. And it's even worse for the younger generations in terms of academics. And it's like across the board. It's not philosophy.
Oh no,
it's all the humanities. Yeah. It's terrible.
No, it is. It's really bad. I mean, I think it's like 75% of credit hours being taught by adjuncts now. It's like there's no tenure jobs.
Yeah.
So it's bad. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's really bad.
Part of that happened just historically because the tenured professors didn't hold the line against that. But what are we going to do? Blame them and say, oh, well, screw tenured professors now. I mean, they're not even the same tenured professors.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one of the things that you pointed out was that, there's a demand. So people realize they're like, my life stinks. I don't enjoy what I'm going through right now. They realize that's going on one hand, and kind of all the answers are here in philosophy. But there's a disconnect because people go take a philosophy course. They may not enjoy it. They probably don't understand it. So what are you finding right now that people are looking for? And then also, how can we bridge that gap?
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's a great set of questions. I do want to say too that not all the answers are to be found in philosophy. I think that psychotherapy is also useful. There's a lot of overlap, like in treatment of the emotions in ancient philosophy with Aristotelianism, Neoplatonism, Stoicism, and then good psychotherapy, because there's a lot of bad psychotherapy out there. And then, spiritual or wisdom traditions often have some things to offer as well. And we do want to draw on the good psychological research. Again, there's a lot of bad stuff out there, or social scientific research, right? So you want to be somebody who's offering not just, we're gonna read Aristotle or the Stoics, or Simplicius on Epictetus. You want to be bringing in other things as well. But so that's on the I guess you could say the supply side. The demand side, I think some of these things are part of human nature in general, right? There's the big questions thing that sometimes people don't ask until they go through a crisis, and it doesn't have to be a midlife crisis, in the which is a very new thing, by the way. But existential crises, asking about meaning when people die, and becoming aware of your own mortality and thinking about what your legacy is going to be, dealing with suffering, handling good things well. A lot of people don't handle, say, winning the lottery very well, or getting a big inheritance, or meeting the love of their life. They screw that up too. It doesn't all have to be like responses to negative things. It could be, how do you handle positive things? There's a lot of, and I think today in the setting that we're in, what we're seeing is kind of a reversion to a historical norm. And what I mean by that is, again, to make it like generational, the boomers enjoyed an incredibly, except for in terms of like race and sexism and stuff like that, but in general, they enjoyed an economy that was expanding, where there were a lot of warning signs, but they didn't have to see the warning signs. That could be pushed off to further generations. College was accessible, almost free in some places, very, very cheap in other places. If you had student loans, they were not this onerous thing that you had to carry around forever. I remember when my mom actually got sent a letter by the government saying, hey, we noticed that you never paid back your student loans. Do you think you could start making a little bit of a payment on that? I mean, today it would be like, we're docking your pay, we're going to your credit report is going to hell because of this. You better pay up, and so I'll just mention one other thing about this. So again, being Generation X, I remember in the 90s when we were in this, sort of expanding prosperity thing, and trickle down looked like it was working a bit. If you were like working class, which is what I was, you could quit your crappy job and find another crappy job within a week just looking in the paper. And it wouldn't be a great job, but it would be, like I worked as a janitor, as a security guard, tutor, all sorts of things. But you would make enough money to pay for your little studio apartment, be able to eat what you wanted to eat more or less, unless you like ate fancy stuff all the time, buy clothes, pay for your crappy car and its insurance and gas, and you'd be okay, Whereas now that's not the case. We have this much more stratified society with very clear distinctions between income levels. And there's so many ways in which the ordinary person is rather screwed compared to elites. And that's the way it's been historically, right? So the boomers and this like post-war America is this amazing place. Everything's getting better all the time, that a lot of the tech people keep talking as if that's really the case. That was a historical anomaly. And we're now back to where things were, say, in the 1890s, or, when we had these busts and booms and people would starve on the streets, and we'd had, a lot of incredible polarization and all that. So those sorts of things, they make people say, oh, my life kind of sucks. I have to figure out what to do about this. But then the problem is, okay, where do you go? And so there's all these self-help gurus and Facebook groups, and pick whatever you want, that are offering solutions. And a lot of them are not just, sort of neutral, because they're not bad, they're not good. They're just kind of, keeping you out of trouble, keeping you off the street kind of stuff. Some of them are actually positively bad for you, like if you're being told that the way to get out of your inability to move up in your job and relate to your kids and spouse and stay out of arguments with family members is to like put positivity out there into the universe, and the universe will like kick it back to you. That's going to actually make you worse off, right? Because it's not going to happen. And then you're going to feel like crap. Oh, I must not be working the system right, is what they're going to tell you next. So then how do we steer people to things that would be a genuine remedy, and keep them realistic about what kind of remedy it's going to be? Like when you first start studying Stoicism, I always tell people this in our local group, you're going to screw it up so many times, just like if you were learning an instrument. Imagine if you're trying to play the violin. You're not going to sound like some great concert violinist right away. It's going to be, all that horrible sounds, right? And so, how do you keep from getting dismayed or demoralized, right? That has to be part of the lesson, I think, instead of just like giving people a book and saying like, here's Marcus Aurelius, go to it, man. You're going to be just fine, So that's a long answer, but so there's two sides though, right? Supply and demand to this that we have to be really attentive to.
I think that's a really good point too. And what you said at the end too, it's something we've talked about before, this difficulty too of, you sort of have these resources, but it's also not easy to implement them, and it takes time, and it's very challenging at times because getting it right, like we talk about, like even just like the idea of just like habituating something, it's like, well, you got to do it a ton of times, and that means you're going to get it wrong a lot, because the idea is to keep doing it over and over. And it's like, I think when you say it, it's like most people look at that and think oh, it should be like very quick. And I think that's one of the stumbling blocks, for people getting into this and trying to sort of navigate their lives now with, ideally helpful ideas, but you got to also make them work too and put them into practice.
And you hit kind of like plateaus with them, right? So it's you start out with something like the dichotomy of control, right? And there's actually somebody who you should interview is Tim LeBon. who's both he's sort of like me. He's not an orthodox Stoic. He's an eclectic, but he knows a lot about Stoicism. He is also a CBT guy, and he views the dichotomy of control as like the bottom level of what he calls the Stoic elevator. A lot of people think it's like the key masterpiece. No, it's just the ground floor where you get in, and then you move up to higher things, and eventually you start like practicing the virtues and all that. Now, even with the dichotomy of control, this distinction between what's up to us, what's not up to us, or what, there's a lot of ways of translating the epimon and uk epimon. Sometimes, the internal versus the external, the intention versus the result. There's all these different nice ways of framing it. And, you start, first you get introduced to it and you're like, oh, well, what about this? What about that? And then after a while, somebody explains to you, no, if you read Epictetus, you're going to see that he's not saying that every single thought that you have is totally up to you. And the habit is an important thing. And how we use externals matters and all that. And so you're progressing in knowledge, right? And you start practicing some of it. And there's a lot of moments where through the practice, you have these aha places where you're like, oh, I get it. And you wouldn't have that if you just sat in your room, like reading Epictetus without actually applying it. And you'll probably screw it up a lot of times. And then, you get into a discussion with somebody and they're like, no, man, that's not what he's actually saying. Here's what he's saying. So you make it up to like a certain level, and then you like coast for a while, sort of like when you're weightlifting, you don't increase the weights every single week, right? You boost the weights, and then you're going to be sore that week. And then you keep working with that number of sets and reps and exercises. And when it starts to get easier for you, now you have the option of going up a bit. And it works that way with these practices as well. So you get something down. Now maybe it's time for a little bit more challenge. And you do that, and then of course you're sore because it hurts and you screw it up. But you go through another plateau. And that's the way all of these things work, except that there's another point too with like Stoicism or any other intentional way of living, in that it's not just the dichotomy of control. It's this constellation of concepts and practices, and they're all connected to each other. So if you're like, I'm only going to do the one, that's like the guy, imagine if we're going to use a musical metaphor, that's like a guy who's got a triangle and thinks that he's an orchestra. He can ding it all he wants, and he might be really, really good at dinging that triangle. He can make it even make different sounds, right? You ding it on the top and ding it on the bottom. I don't know. I have never really
actually keep our interest. Yeah.
But you get the idea, right? That's not the same thing as like having a guy with an oboe next to you who can actually play some notes, and then having some other percussion that's like real percussion. I don't want to, if there's anybody out there who's like a professional triangulist, I don't want to hurt their feelings or anything, but it's not quite the same thing as like playing, playing the cymbals even.
Yeah.
That's good. You mentioned that you worked in a prison initially, and I'm actually really curious your take on that, because we had kind of like a prison-like experience with the pandemic, with COVID. A lot of people feel stuck where they are. And also just kind of like being for people in prison, kind of enduring through it, which is a Stoic virtue. So what were your thoughts or takeaways from working there? And what do you think that people can benefit from what you know about that?
Well, I'll say this, and this is going to sound kind of harsh. About the COVID thing. So knowing anything about people in prison would really provide some needed perspective to people who are upset about having to stay in their apartment during COVID, because they're not in prison. They don't have guards coming in their cells and tossing everything. They don't have the constant threat of violence. And when it comes to COVID, the people who really were screwed the most and are still screwed are people who are incarcerated, because Prisons, barracks, hospitals, those are the places in plagues that are typically one of the main reservoirs for these things. And being stuck in a cell with people coughing next to you, not being able to move in terribly ventilated, places, eating food that's usually pretty bad, and not having access to decent health care must have been terrifying and probably still is. I mean, some of these prisoners in southern states are being fed that horse dewormer rather than being given inoculations. And we also know too that prison correctional officers are not getting vaccinated for the most part, just like cops. And so for people who are caught up within the criminal justice, it's not even really a system. It's like a whole bunch of interacting arbitrary systems. It's pretty scary. And whatever, I mean, I don't want to diminish the fears that people have about COVID or the inconveniences that they felt about, having to wear masks or social distance or stuff like that, but it ain't being in prison. And so I think that can, like, realizing that and thinking about doing a cognitive exercise, thinking about what would it actually be like to be in prison, and not relying on TV shows or something. I mean, people can just read stuff in the Marshall Project. You can subscribe to it and you'll get all this stuff in your inbox every day about prisons and incarceration and policing. And then you can have like a realistic idea about what it would be like. And the classic Stoics, they talk about prison and exile and things like that as well. And they meant the real stuff, not like, oh, I have to go and quarantine. That's not exile, that's not prison. So there's that aspect. I will say this about prison education. So when it's done right and when it's done in an equitable way, which, by the way, the Bard Prison Initiative does not do. The Bard Prison Initiative, which is based in New York, they are super, super selective. It's affiliated with Bard College. They take the prisoners who they think are most likely to get, the best outcomes. And it's a tiny sliver of the population. They're really good at self-promotion, though. And they actually tried to they tried to tell us here in Wisconsin with our Second Chance Pell program how we ought to do things, because that's part of what they do. When you have a real prison program like what we had in Indiana, where at Ball State University, there were over 100 professors from Ball State University who were teaching in the prisons. Some of them full-time like myself, some of them as part of their teaching load, but these were all either tenured or tenure track professors. That's a real program. And it changed lives. We know this from looking at recidivism statistics, which don't get run very often because, the people who run the prisons, they don't want people not coming back to prisons. But if you want to keep people from coming back, one of the best ways to do it is through education, and not business education, liberal arts, where they have to think about things and they're learning about how to take positions on themselves and transform themselves. I was really fortunate to work at Indiana State Prison, which is a maximum security prison. And part of the reasons why I was really fortunate had to do with Ball State having been there for 20 years and the culture of maximum versus medium security. So like in medium security, people are coming in, going out a lot. Maximum security, people have long sentences. So they're there and they're there to like figure out what to do with their time and their life. So it's not a total wash. And sometimes it takes them a couple of years of getting in fights and, doing drugs or, trying to beat the system in some way before they realize it. But they could get into education. And because Ball State had been there for 20 years when I got there, there was this incredible culture and reservoir of older men who would counsel the younger men about how to get through college, how to do well, whose classes to take, whose classes to avoid. I mean, some of this stuff was like, here's how to pass the test that the guy never changes. We've got like dossiers on them. But, if you're a good teacher, you don't do that sort of thing. Yeah. But a lot of it was like, so you're getting discouraged Here's what I went through. Here's who you can go to. Here's the resources and practices that you can use. And some of these guys were using Stoicism, by the way. Epictetus was incredibly popular in Indiana State Prison. So that made my job teaching much easier, because I could count on, when you're teaching, you want to think about not just what happens in the classroom, but all the things that are happening outside of the classroom that are engaging with whatever you're teaching, right? And so it was as if I had been given anonymous TAs and life coaches who would help my students with that. Now, that didn't happen at every prison, right? Obviously, because it was kind of a weird dynamic, and not every prison teaching system was like what we had in Indiana while it lasted. But there's incredible potential for it. I ended up teaching in two other programs. In North Carolina, I taught at Sampson Correctional Institute, and it was night and day. I mean, it was a medium security prison. They didn't really have things well organized. The guys were happy to have me teaching this class, but it didn't really work out that well, and I didn't continue with them. And then here in Wisconsin, online, I've been teaching in the Second Chance Pell program through Milwaukee Area Technical College, and that's had a lot of challenges. I'm actually not teaching for them anymore, in part because I didn't like the way that they were trying to set things up. But the fact that it exists is really quite important, and it gives hope to people. The fact that, I guess, I mean, this is going to sound kind of silly, but it's a way of showing in a incredibly hostile environment that not everybody's hostile to you, and that you're being cared for in a way, and not in the same way that like volunteers coming in and talking nice to you, or being in a religious group or something like that is doing. It's education, and so it offers them a chance to grow. I think probably somewhere in there was probably something about philosophy, so I think philosophy should be part of that. But I'll say as well that a lot of people can't teach philosophy in prison or to prisoners, and it's not just because they're doing this niche thing that nobody's interested in except for them, or because they can't communicate effectively. You also got to have, you got to be kind of open to prisoners, but you got to also know that they're criminals, and that some of them are going to try to turn you, and you're not going to know until you've worked with them for a while whether the stuff they're telling you is actually true or false. And if you are like in physical proximity, some of them could be dangerous. So I think some people go in and they're kind of naive about that. They're like, oh, these poor guys, because they'll all tell you when you first come in the same thing they tell judges, reporters, volunteers: I'm innocent. After you've known them for a while, they'll open up and they'll be like, yeah, I not only did the thing I got convicted for, I also did all these other things over here, because they want to talk to you about how they're fixing their life and improving it. They want to get resources for it, but they'll kind of BS you at first, a lot of them, and so some people get taken advantage of through that, or even turned into criminal activity of their own. We had that happen a couple of times.
That's funny. It's funny what you mentioned there, though, because the idea that the way you speak of the program, especially the one, sounds like the one at the maximum that did sounds like a lot of good, though. It's also they can be helpful that way, but it also shows us too, I think, that just the importance of getting education and exploring different ideas, not only for prisoners but for everyone, to better our lives. I mean, it's crucial, because we can get stuck even in even free and on the outside. You can get stuck in a routine and kind of just lose your way just by you just stop exploring, stop learning, stop educating yourself. And I think that's like one of the biggest sort of detriments to life, and that's what leads a lot of times to these crises where we start looking then for solutions.
You can do it too in a way that you think you're getting educated, right? Because there's like an entire industry out there to give you superficial semi-education. A lot of the self-help stuff is like that, but you can get on all these people's websites and newsletters and get like a little, so let's take Stoicism, right? There's all these people floating Stoic quotes out there. Stoic quotes, if they're actually real, and half of them aren't actually by the people that they're being attributed to, right? Or they're a super loose paraphrase. They're not what the text actually says. That's not going to help you. It's sort of like eating candy. It feels good at first, but there's nothing nourishing in it. You can use a passage or a quote through practices, but just having like a tattoo or wearing a t-shirt or a challenge coin, or pick whatever you want, that doesn't do anything. And so, I think a lot of people they buy into that sort of thing because that's happening with everything else as well. Yeah. So, sometimes you got to be rough with people and be like, yeah, that it's cool that you like to spend your money on that or spend your time on that, but wouldn't you like something that's got some real substance to it, and then they might be sad about that. It's kind of a natural response to get sad or angry or anxious. Am I doing it right? So we have to cut through an entire industry of people who are trying to sell us like their coaching platform, and you can tell. I mean, you go into the Facebook Stoic group, either one of the two big ones, the closed one or the big open one, and there's hucksters on there trying to sell you stuff, and the moderators have a hard time getting rid of that. And you could say this about anything else as well, I suppose. Yoga, that's a big one for this.
And those ways can also be at least a means for somebody to get interested in it too.
That's hopefully.
Right. And maybe go beyond it too.
Yeah, that's the crucial thing, right? Yeah. And I hear this so often with like people who are, they're not the real deal. Oh, but at least by reading them, I'm getting introduced to some of the ideas. Great. So the test then is, are you actually moving past them, and are you leaving them behind? And I think that very often what we see is people not doing that. So I'm not going to pick on anybody or name anybody in particular, but there are some pretty popular sites out there that churn out a lot of content, and it's fine if that got somebody originally interested in Stoicism, but at a certain point they ought to leave that behind. And if they're not reading, one of the measures for me, are you actually reading Epictetus's discourses, Seneca's letters, and not just reading Marcus Aurelius's meditations? And how often are you doing it? And how are you incorporating this continued learning into it? And if you're reading like contemporary stuff, are you reading people like Massimo, or are you reading other stuff that's not quite as well informed?
Yeah.
What is it?
It's a tough one.
What is it about Stoicism that kind of got you interested in it? Like, what would you say are some things about Stoicism that you find interesting?
Well, I got exposed to it early on in my education, but in the typical way that happens with like philosophy stuff, where you study your ancient philosophy and they'll have you read Epictetus's Enchiridion. And I read Marcus's meditations. And I was, at that time I was like fresh out of the army, going to college as a essentially first generation college student, had just picked philosophy because I thought it sounded cool. And I was much more attracted to like what we oftentimes we make that distinction between lowercase s Stoicism, I'm going to be a tough guy, nothing's going to get to me, which is not real Stoicism, and then the uppercase Stoicism, which is the real Stoicism. So I was into the lowercase Stoicism at that time. And, I basically ignored all the stuff about virtue and wisdom, because I was more into the, like, I can use this to shield myself against the world. So at that time, I was actually much more into existentialism, particularly Sartre and Camus and Nietzsche, than I was the Stoics. And then the two things that drew me in, one was being in a used bookstore in Southern Illinois, in Carbondale. There was a great used bookstore on the Strip. and I got Epictetus's discourses there. And I was reading through it, and I was interested in issues of like, responsibility and free will and agency and how do we build habits and all that sort of stuff that I was getting through like Plato and Aristotle and other thinkers. And I started reading this in the bookstore, and I was like, holy crap, Epictetus is talking about this too. This is really cool, And so then Epictetus became a big favorite of mine. And then the other thing that really got me into it, and this would be around the time I started working in the prison, so the early 2000s, was I started doing a lot of work, which I'd already begun in grad school, on what philosophy could contribute for anger management. Because I was a very angry person, and I still struggle with anger. Thank God, not to the extent that I did in the past. I mean, to the point where it burned professional bridges, got me in when I was a kid in juvenile detention facilities, made a ward of the courts. My mom actually had to file a uncontrollability petition against me that made me essentially the property of the court. Led to a lot of rough times in relationships and family things, and broke some friendships up. So I was ready to, when I saw that Aristotle had a lot to say that was like super useful about anger, that went beyond what most of the psychotherapies actually had to say. I also started looking in other areas, and I found that in ancient philosophy, there's basically 5 main, you could say, reservoirs of wisdom Western philosophy when it comes to anger. One of them is Aristotle and the Aristotelian tradition. One is the Stoic tradition, and so I began exploring it. The Epicureans also have some really useful things to say. The Platonists, and by that I don't just mean Plato, but I mean the Middle Platonists like Plutarch, who has an entire book on controlling anger, and then the later Neoplatonists, and then Jewish and Christian thinkers. Lactantius has this amazing thing on the divine anger that actually talks a lot about human anger and surveys all these other philosophical points of view. So I was doing a lot of work on that, and that led me into taking Stoicism more seriously as a philosophy, because I was looking for, if you're looking for those little nuggets, you got to read all the other stuff around it, right?
Yeah.
And so, eventually then I began doing not just writing and research on anger, but coaching and doing workshops and things like that. And I bring the Stoics in. I don't actually think that they're completely right. I have a position that's kind of eclectic, bringing together the Aristotelians and the Platonists and the Epicureans, and connecting them together with a very powerful framework that the Stoics have for us on the emotions. And then, it's sort of like hanging out with a bunch of friends or a family, right? You talk with this one person over here all the time, and they're friends with these people, or they hang out with these people. You start like getting interested in these. And that's the way it was with Stoicism. I got interested in, well, what are the virtues, and how do we, build them up, and what do we do with this other stuff over here? And then, there's one other factor I'll add too, which is that I got brought into the modern Stoicism team because I had some editorial experience, and the editor of Stoicism Today wanted to step down, and I'd written a few things about Stoicism that they liked. So they brought me in, and I started interacting with Donald Robertson and Chris Gill and John Sellers and Massimo Pigliucci and all these people fairly routinely, Tim Laban. And then that like expanded out to getting to meet some of my scholarly, you could call them like heroes or rock stars, like Julia Annas and Margaret Graver and Chris Gill, obviously, and Anthony Long. And so it became kind of a thing where I was tied in with, it's not exactly a family, but it's like a network, right?
Yeah.
And when you have something like that, that helps to open up your eyes to other sides of things. And other people in it are very smart, and they're like, hey, I've got this new piece on this. take a look at it and you're like, oh yeah, I never saw that about Seneca. That's really good. I'm gonna use that, right? So you grow by using what other people have brought in. And sometimes they can also call you on your bullshit too, which is good. Long story short, it was sort of like a couple different progressive steps. And I think, you could tell similar stories with a lot of people. It's not like anybody reads a Stoic website and they're like, holy crap, this is the thing for me. Now I'm a Stoic. It's, like kind of bit by bit by bit, right? That's the healthy way to do it.
I really like to, oh, sorry. I was going to say, I really liked how you mentioned though, having something in your life that you were trying to deal with and using that sort of as your entry point, right? And that's, I think, really good when you can identify something that you want to work on, and then you're kind of going out and looking for ideas that might help you find ways to work on that or to develop. Like you said with your anger, that's a great way to go into it though, because you have something practical to focus on too, to apply it.
Anger is a really tough one, because if you have anger problems and then somebody says, well, here, you should try doing this, and it's something that's hard, then you often get angry at them.
That's pretty good.
Yeah. So maybe if you're going to do Stoic anger stuff, you don't tell people right off the bat. The Stoics thought that all anger was bad, that's probably not the starting point you should pick, right? Because they're just going to get ticked off at you and they'll be like, this is BS. Why do I have to buy into this stuff? And maybe for each thing, like some people really are struggling with anxiety. I think that's more than anger. That's probably the emotion that drives people to studying Stoic philosophy and practice the most. Telling them right off the bat, anxiety is always wrong. That's probably not going to be helpful.
No. Probably not right off the bat. Got to build to it.
Yeah.
All right, that's good.
Anything else you wanted to ask, Danny?
No, that's good. I mean, that's good. That was a good conversation. I enjoyed it.
Absolutely awesome. I mean, I think we all learned a lot from that. Greg, thank you so much for joining us today. We will.
You're very welcome.
Thanks, man.
Yeah, we will add links to a lot of your places down in the comments or down in the description. And then, thank everyone out there for listening to episode 49 of the Existential Stoic podcast. I'm Randy. That's Danny. That's Greg. Thank you guys. Have a good one.
Later.